At 03:18 a.m. on January 18, 2025, while diplomatic channels debated the language of restraint and news cycles focused on surface tensions, something far more significant was happening beneath the Persian Gulf. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was about to unveil a capability that would fundamentally alter the naval calculus of the region. Not a weapon, not a declaration. A space. 500 meters below the waterline, carved into rock and reinforced with decades of engineering secrecy, an underground naval missile base became operational. The world learned about it through carefully released footage. State television cameras descended into tunnels wide enough to accommodate fast attack craft. Long rows of Tariq-class speedboats sat ready, each one equipped with cruise missiles capable of striking targets dozens of miles away. The lighting was industrial, the atmosphere was compressed. Every surface spoke of preparation, not performance. This was not theater, this was infrastructure. IRGC Chief Commander Hossein Salami walked through the facility flanked by senior officers. His words were measured but unmistakable. This base, he said, was one of several. Not the only one among many. The implications settled into intelligence briefings across multiple continents within hours. Iran had not built a single fortified position. It had built a network, underground, dispersed, invisible to satellites that could photograph license plates from orbit but could not penetrate solid rock. For analysts studying the footage frame by frame, certain details mattered more than others. The access tunnels were designed for rapid deployment. Concealed exit points led directly to open water, camouflaged under natural terrain or retractable covers, engineered to appear as coastline from above. The boats themselves were small, fast, and expendable in the calculus of asymmetric warfare. But their payloads were not. Cruise missiles with precision guidance, naval mines capable of closing choke points, swarm coordination systems that turned individual vessels into coordinated strike packages. The depth of 500 meters was not accidental. It placed the facility beyond the reach of most conventional munitions. Bunker busters designed to penetrate hardened targets would struggle against layered rock and reinforced concrete at that depth. Even if the exact location were known, destroying it would require ordnance. Few nations possessed, and political will fewer still could sustain. Iran had studied the lessons of previous conflicts. It had watched precision strikes obliterate surface installations in Iraq, Libya, Syria. It had absorbed those lessons and buried its capability where satellites could not see and missiles could not reach. Across the Arabian Sea, aboard guided missile destroyers and carrier strike groups, U.S. Navy intelligence officers received the footage within minutes of its release. They watched it once for content, twice for detail, 3 times for implications. The analysis began immediately. Tunnel dimensions, boat configurations, missile types, deployment readiness. Every visible element was cataloged, cross-referenced, and fed into threat assessments that had been years in development. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier displacing over 100,000 tons, altered course 72 hours later. No announcement preceded the movement. No press release explained the timing. The ship simply turned toward the Middle East, engines steady, formation tight. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers adjusted their positions to match. Somewhere below the surface, attack submarines moved ahead, listening, mapping, waiting. This was not a show of force. It was a statement of presence. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, screens displayed a maritime environment grown suddenly more complex. Red circles marked known Iranian naval assets. Blue icons tracked friendly forces. Gray zones indicated areas where certainty dissolved into probability. And now, somewhere beneath the Persian Gulf, a new variable existed. An underground facility housing an unknown number of fast attack craft with unknown deployment timelines and unknown strike radii. The gray zones expanded. Iran's strategy was not new, but its implementation had reached a level of sophistication that demanded reassessment. For decades, the Islamic Republic had pursued what military planners call asymmetric warfare. The concept is simple. When facing a superior conventional force, do not match it symmetrically. Instead, impose costs in domains where the adversary's advantages matter less. Speed over size, concealment over visibility, dispersal over concentration. 1,000 small threats instead of 10 large ones. The underground base embodied that philosophy perfectly. U.S. carrier strike groups dominated open ocean. They projected power across vast distances, controlled airspace for hundreds of miles, and could deliver ordnance with precision unmatched in history. But none of that mattered if the target was invisible until the moment it struck. Fast attack craft emerging from concealed tunnels could launch missiles and retreat before response systems even acquired them. Naval mines deployed from underground facilities could close the Strait of Hormuz, through which 21% of global petroleum passes daily without a single Iranian vessel appearing on radar. The threat was not hypothetical. It was geometric. Each underground base multiplied the surveillance burden on opposing forces. Each concealed tunnel required dedicated intelligence assets to monitor. Each potential exit point demanded continuous observation. The system scaled in Iran's favor. Building one more tunnel cost less than deploying one more surveillance platform to watch it. And the tunnels did not need maintenance crews visible from space or fuel convoys that satellites could track. They simply existed, waiting. In Washington, the calculus shifted quietly but unmistakably. Previous deterrence models had assumed visibility. If you could see Iranian naval assets, you could target them. If you could target them, you could neutralize them before they posed a threat. The underground bases broke that assumption. You could not see what was buried 500 meters below rock. You could not target what you could not locate precisely. And without precise location data, even the most advanced weapons became irrelevant. The USS Abraham Lincoln continued its deployment, entering the U.S. Central Command area of operations on January 27, 2026. The carrier was not alone. USS Delbert D. Black, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, joined the formation. Two more destroyers positioned themselves in the Red Sea. The concentration of firepower was unmistakable. Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets deep inside Iran. Aegis combat systems providing air and missile defense. FA-18. Super Hornets staged on deck, ready for sorties measured in minutes, not hours. Yet all that capability faced a paradox. The more forces concentrated in the region, the more valuable Iran's underground infrastructure became. The carrier strike group was a target, not just a weapon. Its position was known, its movement was predictable. Its defense against saturation attacks from multiple directions was finite. Iranian planners understood this. They had run the scenarios countless times. How many missiles would it take to overwhelm a destroyer's defense system? How many fast attack craft launching simultaneously could saturate targeting radars? The answers existed in classified assessments, but the questions themselves revealed the shift in strategic balance. Inside Iran's command structure, the unveiling of the underground base served multiple purposes. Externally, it signaled capability and resolve. Internally, it reassured a population facing economic pressure and diplomatic isolation that their military could still impose costs on adversaries. Strategically, it forced opponents to recalculate risk in ways that favored restraint. And operationally, it provided commanders with options they had not possessed before. The base was not the only one. Throughout January and February 2025, Iran unveiled multiple underground facilities. On January 10th, the IRGC Aerospace Force revealed another missile city, housing ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers. On February 2nd, coastal defense missiles were shown, stored in reinforced underground tunnels, shielded from airstrikes but ready for rapid deployment. On March 25th, yet another facility appeared in state media, displaying liquid and solid fuel missiles lined up in tunnels that stretched beyond camera view. Each revelation carried the same message. Iran's missile and naval capabilities were no longer concentrated in visible, vulnerable installations. They were dispersed, hardened, and designed to survive first strikes. The entire strategic architecture had shifted from deterrence through capability to deterrence through survivability. It did not matter if an adversary could destroy one base if 10 others remained operational. It did not matter if satellites could photograph surface activity if the real threat lived underground. For the U.S. Navy, the response required adaptation on multiple levels. Surveillance intensified. Intelligence assets focused on coastal areas where concealed exits might exist. Submarine activity increased, listening for acoustic signatures that might indicate tunnel construction or vessel movement. Satellite passes were retasked to capture any surface disturbance that could reveal underground activity. But all of this consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. The crew aboard the Abraham Lincoln operated under heightened alert that became routine. Watches rotated every 4 hours. Maintenance schedules compressed. Flight operations continued day and night, aircraft launching and recovering in cycles designed to maintain constant coverage. Every radar contact was evaluated. Every unidentified vessel was tracked until classification was certain. The operational tempo was manageable for days, for weeks. It strained logistics. For months, it degraded readiness in ways that did not appear in official assessments, but shaped decisions nonetheless. Iranian forces mirrored the pressure. Underground bases offered protection, but they also imposed constraints. Crews could not remain underground indefinitely. Equipment required maintenance that could not always be performed in confined spaces. Communication between dispersed facilities created electronic signatures that could be exploited. The advantage of concealment came with the cost of coordination. Both sides felt the weight of sustained readiness without resolution. On January 31st, 2026, Iran announced naval drills in the Strait of Hormuz. The notice to mariners was routine in language, extraordinary in timing. Live fire exercises in shipping lanes where U.S. warships operated daily. The coordinates provided placed the drill area within the traffic separation scheme, where commercial vessels transited in narrow corridors. The northern lane, used by inbound traffic, fell within the exercise zone. The implications were clear. Any vessel in that space during the drill would be at risk. Iranian or American, military or civilian. U.S. Central Command responded with measured firmness. A statement acknowledged Iran's right to operate in international waters, but warned against actions that could threaten U.S. forces or commercial shipping. The language was careful, not threatening, not passive, calculated to establish boundaries without forcing confrontation. But beneath the diplomatic phrasing lay operational reality. If Iranian vessels pointed weapons toward U.S. warships, response protocols would activate. If missiles were launched, even in exercises, defensive systems would engage. The margin for misunderstanding had compressed to seconds. The drills proceeded on schedule. Iranian fast attack craft emerged from coastal positions, maneuvering in patterns designed to test coordination and reaction times. No weapons were fired at U.S. vessels. No confrontation occurred. But every movement was observed, recorded, and analyzed. The distance between Iranian boats and American destroyers narrowed at moments, then widened. Radar locks were briefly established, then released. Electronic warfare systems probed and withdrew. This was communication through action, each side testing thresholds without crossing them. For civilian observers, the drills appeared routine. For those inside the system, they represented something more dangerous, the normalization of proximity. When forces operate this close regularly, distinguishing between exercise and attack becomes harder. When crews spend months at heightened alert, fatigue erodes judgment. When commanders face ambiguous situations repeatedly, the temptation to clarify through action grows. History offers no shortage of examples where routine operations spiraled into conflict because one side misread the other's intent at the worst possible moment. The underground bases complicated this dynamic further. When Iranian vessels appeared during exercises, questions arose. Had they launched from surface facilities or underground exits? Were they operating independently or as part of coordinated strike packages? How many more vessels remained hidden, ready to surge if the exercise transitioned to engagement? The answers existed in intelligence assessments marked classified, but uncertainty remained. And uncertainty, when forces are this close, becomes dangerous. Inside the Pentagon, planners confronted a strategic puzzle without clean solutions. The underground facilities could not be ignored. They represented a genuine capability shift that altered the balance of power in confined waters. But addressing them militarily would require sustained operations with costs that exceeded the threat they posed in peacetime. Economic and diplomatic pressure could slow Iran's expansion of underground infrastructure, but it could not reverse what already existed. The bases were built, the missiles were stored, the capability was real. U.S. strategy evolved toward containment and deterrence rather than elimination. The carrier strike groups remained in position, maintaining presence without provocation. Submarine activity continued, mapping underwater terrain and acoustic signatures. Intelligence collection intensified, building detailed profiles of known facilities and searching for undisclosed ones. The goal was not to destroy Iran's underground network, but to ensure that using it would trigger consequences Iran could not accept. For Iran, the calculus was similar but inverted. The underground bases provided options without requiring their use. They imposed costs on adversaries through uncertainty rather than action. They demonstrated capability without demonstrating intent. And they allowed Iranian leadership to claim strategic depth in an environment where conventional forces could not compete with American naval power. The bases were defensive in justification, destabilizing in effect. Throughout February 2026, the standoff settled into a pattern that neither side wanted to break, but neither side could resolve. U.S. warships maintained position in operational areas that placed them within range of Iranian coastal defenses. Iranian forces conducted exercises designed to demonstrate readiness without triggering escalation. Diplomatic channels carried messages stripped of optimism, but not yet devoid of communication. Both sides operated on the premise that the other remained rational, calculating, and ultimately deterrable. But rationality under pressure is fragile. On February 15th, an incident tested it. A U.S. surveillance drone operating in international airspace experienced a technical malfunction and drifted toward Iranian territorial waters. Iranian air defense systems tracked it immediately. Alerts propagated through command chains on both sides. The drone corrected course automatically within 90 seconds, returning to its designated patrol area. No weapons were activated. No warnings were issued publicly. But inside both systems, the moment crystallized how little margin remained. For the drone operators, the incident was routine. Equipment malfunctions happened. Automated systems corrected the error before human intervention was necessary. For Iranian air defense crews, it appeared as a violation narrowly avoided or deliberately tested. For commanders evaluating the event afterward, it demonstrated how easily technical failure could be misinterpreted as intentional provocation. And for planners modeling escalation scenarios, it confirmed that control was conditional, not guaranteed. The underground bases remained. The carrier strike groups remained. The tension remained. What changed was the shared recognition that this state could not be sustained indefinitely without incident. Systems designed for crisis management were being used for routine operations. Personnel trained for war were being asked to maintain peace under conditions that blurred the distinction. Equipment meant for decisive action was being employed for signaling and deterrence. The entire structure was under stress that accumulated rather than resolved. In late February, satellite imagery captured new activity at coastal sites associated with underground facilities. Excavation equipment appeared at locations previously dormant. Concrete deliveries increased. Construction patterns suggested expansion of existing tunnels or development of new ones. The analysis was inconclusive about intent, but clear about direction. Iran was not scaling back its underground infrastructure. It was expanding it. Each new facility multiplied the surveillance burden. Each new tunnel represented a gap in coverage that adversaries could not close without unsustainable resource allocation. The U.S. response was measured but persistent. Additional intelligence assets were deployed. Surveillance patterns adjusted to cover new sites. Diplomatic channels delivered messages about escalation and consequence. But none of this stopped the construction. Iran had committed to a strategy that played to its strengths. It could build tunnels faster than satellites could monitor them. It could disperse forces cheaper than opponents could concentrate surveillance. It could impose costs through uncertainty that exceeded the costs of creating that uncertainty. By early March 2026, the strategic landscape had shifted in ways that defied traditional metrics. No battles had been fought. No territory had changed hands. No declarations had been made. Yet the balance of power in the Persian Gulf was different than it had been 3 months earlier. Iran's underground network had created a persistent threat that could not be eliminated without unacceptable escalation. U.S. naval presence had established deterrence that prevented Iranian adventurism, but could not reverse Iranian preparations. Both sides had achieved stalemate, which in geopolitics is often the most dangerous outcome. Stalemate does not resolve. It persists, and persistence under tension breeds incidents. The longer forces operate in close proximity, the more opportunities exist for misunderstanding. The longer surveillance remains intense, the more likely technical failures will be misread as hostile action. The longer crews remain at heightened alert, the more human error becomes probable. This is not speculation. This is the historical pattern of military standoffs that transitioned from deterrence to conflict not because anyone chose war, but because the system for avoiding it failed under accumulated stress. Inside Iranian command centers, officers understood this as clearly as their American counterparts. The underground bases provided capability, but capability without use is burden. Crews rotated through facilities designed for rapid deployment, but employed for indefinite standby. Maintenance consumed resources without producing operational advantage. Coordination between dispersed sites required communication that created electronic signatures adversaries could exploit. The system worked, but it was not sustainable at peak readiness indefinitely. The same reality confronted U.S. forces. Carrier strike groups could maintain station for months, but not without cost. Personnel fatigue accumulated. Equipment wear rates exceeded peacetime norms. Logistics chains stretched, training cycles compressed. The operational tempo was manageable as surge, unsustainable as baseline. Something would have to change. Either the mission parameters would adjust, or the forces would rotate, or the system would degrade until an incident forced change through crisis rather than decision. Neither side wanted that outcome. Both sides prepared for it. This is the paradox of modern deterrence. Success is measured by what does not happen, which means it is never clear if policies are working or if disaster has simply been postponed. The underground bases ensured Iran could impose costs if attacked. The carrier strike groups ensured those costs would be exceeded by American response. The balance held, for now. But balance is not peace. It is controlled instability, and control is only as strong as the weakest link in a chain of decisions made under pressure by imperfect humans operating imperfect systems in an environment where margins for error approach zero. As March progressed, the world's attention shifted to other crises. Headlines moved on. Analysis focused elsewhere. But in the Persian Gulf, nothing changed. The underground bases remained operational. The carrier strike groups remained on station. The surveillance continued. The drills repeated. The proximity persisted. And with each passing week, the likelihood grew that routine would be shattered by exception. Not because anyone planned it, because sustained tension eventually finds release. The silent threat was not the missiles in underground tunnels. It was not the carrier strike groups offshore. It was not even the possibility of deliberate attack. The silent threat was the accumulation of small risks into systemic fragility. The assumption that systems designed for crisis could operate indefinitely at crisis levels without failing. The belief that human judgment would remain sound under prolonged stress. The hope that technical malfunctions would always be corrected before being misinterpreted. These were not guarantees. They were bets. And the longer the standoff continued, the more times those bets were placed. Eventually, statistically, inevitably, one would fail. Not because of malice, not because of miscalculation, because complex systems under sustained pressure degrade in ways that defy prediction until the moment of failure arrives. For civilians, the threat remained abstract. Energy prices fluctuated slightly. Insurance rates for shipping adjusted upward. News reports mentioned tension without conveying the reality of forces operating in compressed proximity with overlapping capabilities and minimal communication. Life continued. Markets functioned. Normalcy persisted. But normalcy in this context was illusion. Beneath the surface, quite literally in Iran's case, preparations continued for a confrontation no one wanted but everyone anticipated. The underground bases would not be the last word. Neither would the carrier strike groups. This was a cycle that had repeated across decades. Technology changed. Platforms evolved. But the fundamental dynamic remained. States pursued capabilities that adversaries could not ignore but could not eliminate. Deterrence was established through capability demonstration. Tension rose until some combination of fatigue, diplomatic progress, or external distraction allowed gradual de-escalation. Then the cycle would begin again at a higher baseline of capability and closer thresholds of response. What made this iteration different was the compression of time and space. Previous standoffs played out over thousands of miles and weeks of decision-making. The underground bases and carrier strike groups operated within ranges measured in minutes. Missile flight times from launch to impact could be under 5 minutes in some scenarios. Decision timelines compressed to match. This left less room for diplomacy, less time for verification, less opportunity for leaders to pause and reconsider before automated systems or field commanders made choices that could not be reversed. The world watched without seeing. Satellites photographed surfaces while threats grew underground. Analysts tracked vessel movements while the real story unfolded in facilities invisible to observation. News cycles focused on statements while the substance lay in silences, and capabilities developed without announcement, and preparations made without acknowledgement. The most dangerous phase of any crisis is often the one that appears calm, because calm in geopolitics frequently means both sides are waiting to see who moves first. Neither side had moved first yet. Both sides had moved constantly, adjusting position, refining capability, testing response. The question was not if one side would eventually take action the other could not accept. The question was whether that action would be deliberate or accidental, and whether the distinction would matter in the seconds available to decide how to respond. The underground bases ensured Iran could hurt American forces if conflict came. The carrier strike groups ensured that hurt would be answered disproportionately. The balance was clear. What remained unclear was whether clarity would prevent catastrophe or simply ensure both sides knew exactly what they were risking when the system finally failed. As spring approached, the standoff had no end in sight, just continuation, just presence, just waiting. And in that waiting, the silent threat grew louder, not through action, but through proximity, not through intent, but through inevitability, not through planning, but through the simple mathematics of complex systems under sustained stress. Something would break eventually. The only questions were when, how, and whether anyone would be able to stop what followed. The personnel operating inside these systems understood the weight of that reality more intimately than any briefing could convey. Radar operators aboard U.S. destroyers stared into screens for hours, watching contacts that might be fishing vessels or might be fast attack craft testing approach vectors. Iranian crew members inside underground facilities ran system checks on missiles that might never launch, but had to remain ready as if launch was imminent. Both groups lived with the knowledge that their decisions, made in seconds under incomplete information, could determine whether families thousands of miles away would experience a world at peace or a region at war. That human dimension rarely appeared in strategic assessments. Analysts modeled capabilities and calculated exchange ratios and projected escalation ladders with mathematical precision. But mathematics did not account for the sailor who had been awake for 20 hours when an ambiguous radar signature appeared. It did not factor the stress of an Iranian officer deciding whether an approaching aircraft was reconnaissance or the first wave of an attack package. It did not measure the cumulative effect of months spent in tunnels where sunlight never reached, and every sound echoed with potential significance. These were not weaknesses to be corrected through better training or more advanced technology. They were inherent features of any system that relied on human judgment under conditions designed to compress that judgment into impossibly small timeframes. The underground bases and carrier strike groups represented technological sophistication that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. Yet they were operated by people whose biological limits had not changed since the first naval conflicts in antiquity. Fatigue, stress, fear, uncertainty. These remained constant even as the weapons evolved. In the final analysis, the silent threat was not technological. It was human. The threat that someone, somewhere in the chain of decisions that separated peace from conflict, would make the choice that seemed correct in the moment but proved catastrophic in retrospect. The threat that an automated system would malfunction at precisely the wrong moment and that human operators would trust the machine over their instincts. The threat that two sides, both convinced they were acting defensively, would find themselves in a war neither chose because the space between defensive preparation and offensive action had compressed beyond the point where distinction mattered. History would record what happened next. Whether the standoff dissolved gradually as attention shifted and forces rotated and priorities changed, whether an incident forced de-escalation before it forced escalation, or whether the silent threat finally found its voice in a way that could not be ignored, could not be contained, and could not be undone. The answer existed somewhere in the future, shaped by decisions not yet made, constrained by systems already in place, and threatened by risks that accumulated second by second without pause, without announcement, and without guarantee that anyone would recognize the moment of transition until it had already passed.